The patient craft of the Drystone wall. There is a particular kind of grey that belongs to a Drystone wall in the soft light of a clouded morning, and it is not really one grey at all but many, layered and overlapping, the colour of weathered limestone and old granite and the lichens that have settled on the stones over decades of patient growth. To walk along such a wall, running a hand absent-mindedly over its rough top stones, is to touch something that was made entirely by hand, stone by stone, without mortar of any kind, held together by nothing but its own weight and the careful judgment of whoever built it. Some of these walls have stood for 200 years. Some for far longer. And every single stone in them was lifted, considered, turned this way and that, and set down in its place by a person who took the time to get it right, because a stone set wrong would not stay, and a wall built carelessly would not last the winter. The Drystone wall is one of the oldest forms of building still practiced in essentially its original way. There is no machine that can do it, not really, because the heart of the craft is judgment, and judgment cannot be automated. The waller picks up a stone, feels its weight and shape, looks at the gap it must fill, and decides, in a moment that draws on years of accumulated feel, exactly how it should sit. It is slow work. A skilled waller building a standard field wall might complete somewhere between 4 and 7 meters in a full day, and that is considered good going. There is no hurrying it. The wall takes the time the wall takes, and the satisfaction of the craft lies precisely in that unhurriedness, in the steady accumulation of small correct decisions into something long and low and enduring that will outlast the person who made it. To understand how such a wall is built, it helps to begin not with the stones but with the ground. A Drystone wall is only as good as its foundation, and the foundation begins with digging. The waller marks out the line of the wall, often with a length of string stretched taut between two stakes, and then strips away the turf and topsoil along that line down to firm subsoil, because a wall built on soft earth will settle unevenly and tear itself apart over the years. Into this shallow trench go the foundation stones, the largest and heaviest of all the stones in the wall, set deep and firm with their longest dimension running back into the wall rather than along it. This is the first lesson of walling, and it runs through the entire craft. The stones must reach back into the heart of the wall, tying it together through its thickness, rather than lying flat along the face where they would simply slide apart. A wall is not two faces with a gap between them. A wall is a single structure, and every stone must do its part in binding it. Once the foundation is laid, the waller works upward in courses, building the two faces of the wall at the same time, for a Drystone wall is wider at the bottom than at the top, tapering gently inward as it rises in a profile that wallers call the batter. This inward lean is not decorative. It is what gives the wall its remarkable stability, drawing the two faces together toward the top so that they lean into one another and into the center, each side helping to hold the other up. The batter is judged by eye, or with a simple wooden frame called a batter frame set up at intervals along the wall, and the experienced waller comes to feel the correct lean the way a carpenter feels a true edge, almost without thinking about it. Between the two faces, as the wall rises, the waller fills the central cavity with smaller stones, the offcuts and fragments and rounded pieces too awkward to use on the face. This filling is called the hearting, and it is one of the most quietly important parts of the whole structure, though it will never be seen once the wall is finished. The hearting must be packed in carefully, stone by small stone, locking the cavity solid so that there is no loose rattling space inside the wall. A poorly hearted wall, with a hollow loose core, will bulge and slump and eventually collapse, even if its faces look handsome. The temptation, always, is to simply tip a shovelful of rubble into the middle and move on, but the good waller resists it, placing each piece of hearting with the same attention given to the face stones, building the inside of the wall as conscientiously as the outside, even knowing that no one will ever see the difference until, decades later, the wall is still standing when a carelessly built one would have fallen. There is a rhythm to walling that settles over a person who does it for any length of time. You sort the stones first, roughly, into piles by size and shape, because nothing wastes more time than hunting through a heap for the one stone you need. You take the foundation stones, then the larger building stones, then the smaller ones for higher courses where the wall has narrowed, and you keep the flattest and most regular for the very top. As you build, you reach for a stone, you turn it in your hands, you offer it up to the gap, and if it does not sit right you set it down and try another, and you do not force it, because a stone that needs forcing is the wrong stone. The single most important rule, the one repeated to every apprentice waller in every walling country, is this: 1 stone over 2, and 2 stones over 1. Each stone should bridge the joint between the 2 stones below it, so that the vertical gaps are always broken, never running up through the courses in a continuous line of weakness. A wall with running joints is a wall waiting to fall. A wall properly broken bonded, every joint covered, is a wall that will stand through generations of frost and rain. The stones themselves tell you a great deal about where you are in the country, because the Drystone wall is, above all things, a local craft, made from whatever the land provides. In the limestone dales, the walls are pale grey and blocky, the stone breaking into flat, regular pieces that stack almost like rough bricks. In the granite uplands, the walls are made of great rounded boulders, harder to shape and harder to fit, lending those walls a lumpy, organic, ancient look. In the slate regions, thin flat stones are sometimes set on edge in herringbone patterns that catch the eye. The waller does not choose the stone chooses the wall, and the character of every wall in the land is really the character of the rock beneath it, lifted to the surface and stacked. To know stone walls well is to be able to read the geology of a country simply by looking at its field boundaries, the changing color and shape of the walls mapping the changing bedrock below. As the wall rises past waist height, the waller sets in, at intervals, a special kind of stone that runs the full width of the wall, from one face clear through to the other. These are the through stones, or through bands, and they are among the most important stones in the entire structure. Because most of the building stones reach only partway into the wall from each face, there is always a risk that the 2 faces, over time, will gradually separate, the wall splitting down its middle like a book. The through stones prevent this. By spanning the entire width, they pin the 2 faces together, binding the wall into a single mass. They are set in a line at roughly the same height all along the wall, and in many old walls you can see them clearly, their ends protruding slightly from the face at regular intervals, a row of small grey tongues sticking out, each one quietly doing the essential work of holding the whole thing together. A waller setting through stones feels a particular satisfaction, because these are the stones that turn 2 separate piles into one true wall. The work is hard on the body, there is no pretending otherwise. The constant lifting, the bending, the carrying of stone, the kneeling on rough ground, all of it tells on the back and the knees and the hands over the years. Wallers wear out their gloves at a remarkable rate, the rough stone shredding the leather and canvas, and many an old waller has hands like the stone itself, hard and weathered and scarred. And yet there is something in the work that draws people to it and holds them, something in the steady physical rhythm and the visible, tangible progress, the way the wall grows along its line as the hours pass, the way at the end of a day you can stand back and see exactly what you have done, a length of wall that was not there in the morning and will still be there, very likely, a century after you are gone. Few kinds of work offer that. Most labor vanishes the moment it is done, but a wall remains. There is the matter of weather, too, which shapes the walling year. The traditional season for walling has long been the colder months, autumn through to early spring, partly because that is when the farm has less other work demanding hands, and partly because handling stone in the heat of summer is exhausting in a way that working in the cool is not. There is an old affection among wallers for the crisp, still days of late autumn, the breath visible in the air, the ground firm underfoot, the stone cold and clean in the hands. Rain makes the work miserable and the stone slippery and treacherous to lift. Hard frost can make it almost impossible, the stones frozen to the ground and to each other. But on a fine cold day, with a clear sky and no wind, walling is as pleasant a way to spend the daylight hours as the countryside offers. The only sounds the clink and scrape of stone on stone and the occasional call of a crow crossing the field. When the wall has risen to its full height, usually somewhere between 1.5 meters tall, depending on the region and the purpose, it must be finished off along the top, and this finishing is what protects everything below it. The top course is called the coping, or the capstones, and it is built differently from the rest of the wall. Where the building stones lie flat in their courses, the coping stones are most often set upright, standing on edge, packed tightly together in a continuous row along the very top of the wall, leaning slightly all in the same direction. This row of upright stones does several things at once. It adds weight to the top of the wall, pressing down on the courses below and locking them firm. It presents a rough, uncomfortable, unstable surface that discourages livestock from trying to climb or lean on the wall. And it sheds rainwater, throwing it clear of the wall's heart so that water does not sit and soak and freeze within the structure. A well-built coping is the wall's roof and its crown together, and a length of wall topped with a neat, even row of upright coping stones, all leaning at the same angle like a line of dominoes caught mid-fall, is one of the quietly beautiful sights of the walled countryside. There is a thing that happens to a drystone wall over time that is worth dwelling on, because it is part of what makes the craft so forgiving and so durable. A wall built with mortar is rigid, and rigidity is brittle. When the ground heaves with frost, or settles in a drought, or a tree root pushes up beneath it, a mortared wall cracks, because it cannot move. But a drystone wall, held together only by friction and gravity and the cleverness of its construction, can flex. It can settle slightly, shifting its stones a fraction to accommodate the movement of the earth beneath, and then sit firm again in its new position. The very looseness that seems like a weakness is in fact the source of a deep resilience. A drystone wall is not fighting the land, it is going along with it, settling and shrugging and adjusting through the centuries, which is why so many of these walls, built with no binding at all, have outlasted far grander structures raised with mortar and ambition. And walls do, eventually, need attention, for nothing stands entirely untouched forever. A section may slump where the ground was always soft, or where a long-ago badger dug beneath the foundation, or where generations of sheep rubbed against the same spot until the stones loosened. When this happens, the waller does not patch the wall from the outside, propping the bulge back with a few stones, because that never holds. Instead, the damaged section is taken down entirely, the stones lifted out and sorted into their piles once more, and the wall is rebuilt from the foundation up, exactly as it was first made. This is called gapping, the repairing of a gap, and it is much of the work of the modern waller, walking the long boundaries of the upland farms, finding the places where the old walls have fallen and patiently raising them again from their own scattered stones. There is a pleasing thrift to it. The stones are never wasted. A wall that falls is simply a wall waiting to be built again, its materials lying ready on the ground, needing only the time and the hands and the judgment to lift them back into place. The walls of the countryside were not, of course, built for their beauty, though beauty is what many of them have become. They were built for work, to divide the land, to keep livestock where they were meant to be and out of where they were not, to mark the boundary between one holding and the next. In the great age of wall building, particularly during the period when common lands were enclosed and parcelled into fields, Walls were thrown up across the uplands in their thousands of miles, an enormous labor conducted almost entirely by hand over decades, reshaping the open hills into the patchwork of stone-edged fields that we now think of as the natural and timeless face of the countryside, though it is neither natural nor especially timeless, but the accumulated handiwork of countless anonymous wallers whose names are entirely forgotten and whose walls remain. To stand on a high hillside and look out over a landscape of drystone walls is to see a kind of map drawn in stone, the lines running up impossibly steep slopes and across boggy ground and along the tops of ridges, each line representing days and weeks and months of someone's patient labor. The walls go where no machine could have taken stone, up gradients too sheer for any cart, which means every one of those stones was carried up by hand or by the patient work of horses, lifted and set in the high cold air by people for whom this was simply the work that needed doing. There is a humility in contemplating it, in recognizing how much careful, skilled, unrecorded labor is woven into a landscape we tend to take entirely for granted, how every one of those gray lines threading over the hills is in truth a long quiet record of human patience. The craft very nearly died, in the way that so many old handcrafts nearly died, as the work became uneconomic and the people who knew it grew old and the fences of wire went up faster and cheaper than any wall could be built. For a time it seemed that the walls would simply be allowed to fall, gap by gap, year by year, until they melted back into the heaps of stone they had come from. But crafts have a way of being rescued at the edge of their disappearance by people who recognize, just in time, that something irreplaceable is being lost. The walling associations were formed, the skills were written down and taught, the apprentices were trained, the certificates of craftsmanship awarded, and slowly the knowledge that had been passed from hand to hand for centuries was secured against forgetting. Today there are more skilled wallers, in some places, than there have been for generations, and the long grey walls are being rebuilt and maintained by people who took up the craft not because they were born to it but because they chose it, drawn by exactly that quality of patient, tangible, enduring work. There is a competition tradition, too, gentle and good-natured, in which wallers gather to rebuild lengths of wall against the clock and against one another, judged on the soundness and neatness of their work. But even here the pace is unhurried by the standards of most contests, for walling cannot truly be rushed without becoming bad walling, and the judges know it. What they are really judging is the quality of a great many small decisions, the soundness of the hearting that they cannot see, the trueness of the batter, the breaking of the joints, the firmness of every stone. A wall can look fine and be poorly built, and it can look rough and be excellent, and only the experienced eye, and the test of time, can truly tell the difference. The tools of the waller are few and simple, and have changed very little across the centuries, because there is very little about them that could be improved. There is the walling hammer, heavier than a carpenter's hammer, with a flat face for knocking and a chisel-like end for trimming a stone that is almost the right shape but not quite, taking off a knob or an awkward corner so that it sits true. There is the line and the pins, the length of string stretched between two iron stakes to mark the height of each course and keep the face running straight and even. There is the batter frame, the simple wooden A-frame that shows the correct inward lean of the wall. And there is, more than anything, the waller's own eye and hands, the accumulated judgment that no tool can replace. A waller can build a sound wall with almost nothing but a hammer and patience, and many have, working their way along a boundary with a heap of stone and a length of string and the whole long quiet day ahead of them. There is a tradition, too, of building small clever openings into the walls, each with its own regional name and its own purpose, and these are among the most charming details of the craft. There are the small square holes set low in the wall, large enough for a sheep but not a cow to pass through, used to let a flock move between fields without the trouble of a gate. In different parts of the country these are called cripple holes, or lunky holes, or sheep smoots, or hog holes. The same idea wearing a different name in every valley. There are larger smoots left at the bottom of a wall to let a stream or the runoff of heavy rain pass through without building up against the stone and pushing it over. There are stone stiles built into the wall itself, projecting stones set as steps so that a person can climb over where an animal cannot. Each of these is a small problem solved in stone, generations ago, by someone thinking carefully about how the wall would actually be used, and each has been faithfully rebuilt every time that stretch of wall has been repaired since. And a drystone wall, it turns out, is not only a structure but a habitat, a long thin world of its own running across the countryside. The countless small gaps and crevices between the unmortared stones, and the cool dark spaces within the hearting, make a wall into a sheltered home for a remarkable amount of life. Wrens and other small birds nest in its cavities. Lizards and slowworms bask on its sun-warmed stones and slip into its cracks at the first sign of danger. Mice and voles run its length as a covered highway, safe from the hawks above. Spiders and beetles and countless smaller creatures live in its sheltered depths, and the stones themselves are slowly clothed over the years in mosses and lichens and small ferns that root in the seams, so that an old wall becomes a vertical garden of slow, tough, undemanding plants. A wall that has stood for 100 years is its own small ecosystem, and to take it down for repair is to disturb a whole quiet community of things that have made their homes in it, which the thoughtful Waller tries to do gently, and in the colder months when the wall's residents are least active. Consider, for a moment, the simple shape of a single day spent at the wall. The Waller arrives in the early light with the field still wet, and the first task is never building at all but looking, walking the fallen length, reading how it came down, seeing which stones rolled where, planning the work. Then comes the sorting, the unhurried business of turning the scattered heap into ordered piles, the big stones here, the building stones there, the hearting in its own pile, the flat coping stones set carefully aside. Only then does the building begin, and once it begins it settles into that steady rhythm that empties the mind of everything else. Reach, lift, turn, consider, set, reach, lift, turn, consider, set. The morning passes in this way almost without being noticed, marked only by the slow lengthening of the new wall and the gradual shrinking of the stone piles. There is a pause, mid-morning, for tea from a flask, sitting on the unfinished wall with hands wrapped around a warm cup, looking at the work so far. The light shifts as the hours pass, the early flat grey giving way, perhaps, to a thin bright sun that picks out the textures of the stone and warms the back. Birds come and go about their own business in the hedges and the grass. A tractor may pass on a distant lane. By the afternoon the body has found its working pace, neither fast nor slow, and the stones seem to come more easily to hand, the right one appearing in the pile just when it is needed, the gaps seeming to ask for particular shapes that the eye now supplies almost without conscious thought. And then the light begins to go, and the Waller sets the last few stones of the day, perhaps a short stretch of coping to leave the work tidy, and stands back in the gathering dusk to look at what the day has made, a length of true new wall, sound and square and broken bonded and well-hearted, standing where in the morning there was only ruin, and the deep tiredness in the arms and the back is the good kind, the kind that comes from a thing done properly and well, with no corner cut and no haste, a thing that will stand for longer than the person who built it will be remembered. And in the end that is the deep quiet pleasure of the Drystone wall, the thing that makes it such a soothing thing to think about as the day winds down. It is a craft entirely without shortcuts, in which the only way to a good result is the patient, attentive doing of one small thing after another, the lifting and turning and setting of one stone, and then the next, and then the next, with no possibility of haste and no substitute for care. It asks for nothing but time and attention, and it gives back something that lasts for centuries. The Waller works alone in the open air, in the cold clean light, in the company of nothing but the stones and the birds and the slow growth of the wall along its line, and at the end of the day there is a length of something solid and true and enduring where before there was only a gap and a scattered heap, and tomorrow there will be a little more, and the day after that a little more again, the wall reaching steadily on across the field at the unhurried pace of a thing made well, by hand, to last.